Thanks so much, Peter, for that generous introduction, Howard, and for this brilliant conference. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to speak after Akash. Terrific remarks, and to close it. And thank you, Your Honor, for honoring us again with your presence. It's not the first time you've come to something at which I've spoke. Last time it was an organization with Jean Charest, so thank you very much again. Tom Axworthy, one of my own heroes, so I'm going to quote you in a second. But first, the joke. I was at the end of dinner yesterday. We had a wonderful dinner, and I went to Yonge and Dundas Square, and I saw this professor hanging around, and he didn't have a cell phone. He was the only one without a cell phone. So I invited him, my wife and we invited him for a selfie, but he rebuffed us. So that was Howard. So Howard, after this, we'll do a selfie. It's terrific to be here. The title of my talk implicitly is Canada Must Think for Itself, but to think for yourself, you must first think. And to think, you must be curious. And so I'm going to go back a little bit to the evocation of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and Pericles. And the tradition there was one of constant questioning, the Socratic method. Questioning requires curiosity. In the end, it requires skepticism and an endless stubbornness in questioning what is the declaration of the day. And this leads me to quoting Tom, who was quoting Pierre Elliott Trudeau at the time. Let us be intelligent. And my twist on that is, let us think. Now, please don't react in what I think is a very Canadian way and say, I think, I can think. Of course, I understand we all have good educations, but we find ourselves as a society in a very unthinking period. And I'll try to prove that to you. First, to do that, we need to unwind a little bit some of the harder edges of what I think to be a very strong belief system. We are talking about democracy, but I want to bring a little skepticism to the dialogue. If we're talking about let us be intelligent, and you look at the state of democracy, the two senior democracies in the Anglo-American tradition, the United States evidently led by Donald Trump, Britain led by a series of Brexiteering leaders, today the apogee of which is Boris Johnson. I think 50 years from now, the verdict of historians on this period of democracy will be that we are living in the age of degenerates. And I say that with a heavy heart, but it is not high-quality leadership. And this behooves us in Canada to look around and say, well, these are our principal allies. This is our imperial mothership. These are our American cousins. Are these the great exemplars of how a democracy ought to behave, how democratic leadership ought to express itself? And the answer inevitably must be nay. So what are our reference points? We need to think for ourselves. So before I get to how to think for ourselves, I'll say, how did we get here? Let's talk about words. Democracy. First, a disclaimer. I'm a Canadian, I'm a Democrat. I have no party. But whence this hard edge of the belief in democracy? If you look at the founding debates of Canada, the word democracy was only used in the negative. The Americans were the Democrats. If you look at Pierre Berton, democracy and Democrats, these were wicked words. The War of 1812, the invasion of Canada. If you look at the 1867 Constitution Act, which I commend to my children every evening, the founding preamble says nothing, unlike Section 1, about democracy. It says that the Federation will, quote, conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. Right? And then afterward gets into the plumbing of the Federation, which I think is actually beautiful. A lot of our beautiful jurisprudence is about federalism. It is not about democracy for the longest time. Right? But federalism is embedded in the project. A strong central government is embedded in the document, in the structure of the federation, à la différence with the Americans, who were the Democrats. Okay? Now, I understand we're all Democrats today, but let me get to the evolution of the harder edges of the democratic project, because we are slightly in an age of dogmatism, to the detriment of the curiosity that I think is necessary to get us further, to solve some of our ills. Second point. Churchill. What did Churchill say about democracy? Churchill is one of the great World War II heroes, great hero of Anglo-Saxon democracy. He said it with humility. He said, democracy is, in world experience, the worst system of all government, except for all the other governments that have been tried from time to time. Does everyone know that quote? He was actually quoting someone else, but he was using that quote. So it starts in the negative, in a de minimis understanding of democracy. It's actually a terrible way to run a country and enterprise, except for all the others. It does not start by the de maximis proposition that rah, 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 we're Democrats, this is the best system in the history of human evolution, the best thing that God has ever created. De minimis, humble, and humorous, right? Given his circumstances. Go to the prime ministerial speeches of the last century and a half. Google all the speeches of Diefenbaker, Saint-Laurent. Up till, I would say, early to mid-Trudeau, you will find the word democracy as such used very scarcely. Okay? Democracy is used as, we're a parliamentary democracy, we have responsible government, yeah. But we are still a British parliamentary system, and federalism is much more important, a construct. It is with the Charter, which I actually find to be a very brilliant document, and particularly Section 1, which I see a little bit differently, we can discuss that, where democracy is implanted into the actual constitutional framework deliberately in Section 1 and Sections 3 to 5 in the democratic rights. And thereafter, the jurists, the brilliant jurists, Nathalie Desrosiers spoke yesterday, have an opportunity to use democracy literally in the interpretation of the human condition in Canada. That is melded with the end of the Cold War, where democracy evidently prevails. So you have linchpins for democratic jurisprudence, which all of a sudden starts to invade our constitutional political vernacular in Canada, for the better, I think. And also the end of the Cold War, which has a hard edge, which is to say, we won, democracy won. I should know, my parents are from the Soviet Union. They came here because they fancied that the better bet was for democracy. Democracy won. Then you get speeches like Fukuyama, the end of the Cold War, you get triumphalism, you get democracy attempted to be exported to countries like the former Soviet states, the Middle East, and some of the pushback on that, to which we'll return in a second. But I want to say that although democracy begins to concretize in the mind as the apotheosis, the apogee of human political development, it is not sufficient to describe the arc of history to which Akash was referring. And I actually think that arc of history is slightly deficient. We got to broaden a little bit. Here's how. And I think this is probably one of the first times that this is being evoked in this important conference, but it's important for understanding our condition. Who won the Cold War? Well, if I have my students here, they would say, of course, between Reagan and Gorbachev, Reagan won the Cold War. If I ask students, and I often lecture in Ukraine or Russia or Kyrgyzstan recently, who won the Cold War between Reagan, they would grudgingly say probably Reagan. But they might say that the true winner thus far was Deng Xiaoping. So there was a third axis to which we often forget to refer. China snuck up quietly, and actually, until very recently, looked like the most impressive system of the three. You know, I'm not doing a hagiography of China. They've got huge weaknesses. We'll return to them in a second. But there are three major systems in the world today. And democracy is but one of them. And when I try to explain these three systems, I'd like us to start to deconstruct this de maximis understanding of democracy as the best thing since sliced bread to a de minimis, more humble, I would say more skeptical, and definitely more humorous understanding of democracy in the comparative sphere of world affairs. So, democracy is the dominant system in Europe and in North America. Okay? And some edges of Europe actually aren't as solidified along the democratic project as others. I call this the argumentative state. Okay? I strip it of the word democracy because in the West, if I say democracy, all of it was that we're Democrats, we're superior. Right? But if I call it an argumentative state, I start to say, well, these are the things that are really important about democracy. We argue a lot. We contest power. We succeed governments with elections, legitimately. And there's an opposition, and there are feedback mechanisms through the media and the academy and civil society. These are the great strengths, but these are also the main characteristics of democracy. I'll return to the deficiencies in a second. The second major system, and if I refer to what I think is arguably at least the conditional winner of the Cold War, it is the Sinosphere. But it doesn't start in China, it actually starts in Singapore. This is what I call the algorithmic state. These are states driven by a central algorithm, driven by policy elites, planners, who can generalize with reasonable skill the plan across the state with significant effect and competence. Okay? Please don't moralize yet. This is just reality of their system. I'll get to the weaknesses in a second because they're manifest. This is a dominant system in a major part of the world that commands a large share of the human population. Okay? And then there are the majority of the states in between. The whole former Soviet space, except the Baltic republics, all of the Middle East, all of Africa, these are states that are looking for their system. Are we going to become democrats? Are we going to become part of the argumentative state world? The legislatures of Canada and Britain, the parliaments of the Bundestag, the Italian parliament? Or are we going to go the China, Singapore route where we have elites that can deliver the goods, as Akash was saying? They can give us high-speed rail, they can build educational systems. They don't take 10 years to build this one subway line, right? Maybe 20. I'm in Richmond Hill, so it hasn't reached us yet, right where the people live. And these are very difficult choices for these, what I call voyeur states. I know you might think Ukraine is a solid democracy, but Ukraine is a voyeur state trying to figure out which way to go. And Russia's even more so, right? Same with Jordan. Same with Nigeria. These are states that are looking for the best of each system and guarding against the weakness of the other systems. What are the best things in these systems? So we got argumentative states, algorithmic states, and voyeur states. And if I'm in a voyeur condition, I'm rightly, cunningly looking for the best of each. I'm not dogmatically or naively saying, you know what, I really like what Trump is doing. By the way, who in the world is saying, I really like what Trump is doing? I think I want to import that. Who in the world is saying today, I really like what's happening in Britain today, let's import that? Nobody's asking that, right? They might like what we're doing in Canada, though. We still have our wits about us for now. But they're looking cleverly. So what do they learn from us? From us, they learn peaceful transition, elections, argument amongst equal parties and citizens, feeding back into power to correct bad mistakes. They find federalism, which, by the way, is one of the great democratizing constructs in the world. When you federalize, you dampen the brute power of the center, and you give greater value to the individual. That's actually an indirect way of saying democratize, federalize, right? It's one of the genius contributions of Canada, much more than democracy as such. What are the strengths of the algorithmic system? Well, first of all, they can deliver the goods. They really get things done. You want to build high-end transportation, fast, reasonably safe, we can do it. You want to build an education, a medical system, you want to build a scientific complex, you want to change the environmental landscape. The climate change leaders today are not here in North America, they're actually in that algorithmic space because they can mobilize resources much more rapidly. So that's their strength. They got very talented people, very serious people, by the way, who wouldn't accept our arguments about just the inherent moral superiority of our system. We need to meet them face to face and say, you're a different system, we're a system, let's talk. What are the weaknesses? What are the weaknesses of our system versus theirs? Well, the biggest weakness in our system is that we can't think beyond our noses. We can't think beyond the next tweet. I used to work at the Privy Council office. Tom was mentioning Pierre Trudeau's early memos. My first memos were to the clerk of the Privy Council in the Iraq War. I said, Mr. Clerk, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, Trotsky. I gave a lot of thought to our condition at the time, but there was no planning. I worked in priorities and planning. There was no national plan. Nobody could think beyond a year or two, and certainly nobody could execute. And this continues. Now, if we take a very glib, dogmatic approach to the planning problem in Canada, the long-term thinking, I'll give you the example of a discussion I had with a leading Canadian dean who was at an American law school recently. I said, tell me how the United States and Canada plan. What do you mean, Irvin? We don't plan, we're democracies. But that's an unintelligent approach. You are leading with the dogma and the word rather than the mind. You are not being intelligent, right? It's absolutely incurious to say, how do we plan? That we don't plan. You ought to say, how do we plan in the context of a democracy? That ought to be the question. How do we plan, worse still, in the context of a federal democracy? That's the big question for Canada this century. How do we do anything in the context of federal democracy beyond tomorrow? Well, these are strengths that the algorithmic world has in spades. Have we ever asked in the Canadian democratic context, and I know it's not asked in the American context because we're much more dogmatic than us, do we have anything to learn from them? You know, I know they have their pathologies, and we'll get to those in a second because they're more than ours. Do we have anything learned from China and Singapore? Do we have anything to learn from Iran? Do we have anything learned from Russia? Do we have anything learned from India? Vietnam? The question is actually never asked. Never. And this returns to the theme of thinking for ourselves, because if I say that the leadership of the United Kingdom and the United States is degenerate today, then we're in big trouble because we're not thinking beyond that sphere. That's the basic sphere of reference for Canada. It is out, in the United States, it would be incredible today, given the tension between the United States and China, to say, can we learn anything from China? But the Chinese have already done it in reverse. They have actually learned a lot from us. Their entire reform period from the 70s was learning from the West and then excelling us. How come they've done it, but we haven't reversed the favor? The dogmatic approach is that they came here to spy on us. But I lecture to Chinese delegations all the time in droves, and I always say, maybe one of them is a spy out of the 50. The others are here to learn. I hope the spy enjoyed the lecture. Right? But the other 49 went back to China with knowledge, and they did in the English language. Right? How many delegations are we sending out to China, to India, to Russia, to Nigeria, to other leading countries, to Singapore? Zero. I had a recent colleague who went to the Privy Council office. Congratulations, Irvin, I got $1,000 to spend on a conference. Tell me where the action's at. I said, you got to go to Asia. That's where the action's at. They said I got to stay within North America. End of story, right? Because we're confirming ourselves in our backwardness because our examples are too limited. Whereas the dangers of the non-democratic algorithmic systems are greater than those of our system. What are they? Well, the algorithmic world, starting with the post-Soviet space, but also in China, has the great problem of succession. How do you leave power peacefully? You know, Stephen Harper, when he came to power, I'm, by the way, strictly nonpartisan, but he said one interesting thing. He said, I was amazed that they just gave me the keys to the house. And then when I left, I gave the keys to the house. That doesn't happen in any part of this former Soviet space. There's a saying in Ukraine, I say, how's your revolution going? And in Russian they come back, у нас поговорка. Некоторые сидят, другие сидели, остальные будут сидеть. We have a saying in Ukraine. Some are in prison, others have been in prison, and whoever's remaining is going to prison. That's how you leave power, right? Same in Russia. Putin's main problem is not criminality or corruption, it is succession. Where does he go? He must be tired, but he has no dauphin. The first dauphin who comes in will put him into prison, kill him, or exile him. China has a not dissimilar problem. We've got to figure it out in the West. They have another problem that we've figured out. In the algorithmic world, the Chinese have a saying that says, the emperor is very far. You know, the emperor could be more brilliant than our emperors. And by the way, in my view, the Chinese and the Russian leaderships are more impressive than ours right now. They're smarter than us. But they have a problem systemically that we don't have, which is that the emperor is very far. So the emperor can be extremely smart and with a very professional team in Beijing, but the people in Chongqing can't feed back to him. So he will make mistakes. And there's no way of correcting the mistakes. And we have those corrective mechanisms, those feedback mechanisms called elections, they're called tweets, they're called opposition media, and long may they prosper. They provide feedback that the Chinese government is always looking for, by the way, right? Until, by the way, they get taken by surprise by huge protests. The Russians are always looking for feedback. They don't know exactly what's happening in their huge country. They have to engineer not just fake elections, they have to engineer surveys and monitor social media, figure out what's the population thinking. You know, how is this policy going to go down? And their equivalent of the emperor is very far is «До государя правда не доходит». The truth never reaches the czar. There are too many filters beyond, and the population doesn't give feedback on this. So you see, we have strengths and weaknesses. The other great strength in our system is that the individual has sanctity, has absolute value. Not just because of the Charter. The federalism actually puts some distance between the grinds of the executive authority and the condition of the man or woman on the street. Whereas in the algorithmic system, the plan is absolute and it can roll over the individual, especially in large numbers, right? And again, by the way, I don't want to talk about it in terms of rights right away, because as soon as I say that to a Western audience, that evokes the idea of moral superiority, and I'm not talking about that. I'm starting from a de minimis construction. So before I close, our problem in Canada is even more acute because you've got these different systems. We need to be able to incorporate some of the lessons of those other systems to improve our own democratic system. But we have some wicked pressures at our borders that are going to test not just our democracy, but our survival tout court. I don't know, how many people have heard of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Anyone heard of that? So not too many people. It was one of the major democracies of Europe over the last 500 years that lasted 250 years. It covered a major territory, high culture, very sophisticated legal system, quasi-federation, and you've not heard about it. 100 years from now, people may not have heard of Canada, and we will have only survived 150 years, maybe 200 years. This was a country that survived 250 years, and we've not heard about it. So how do we keep this concern going? Well, we need to be able to think beyond the dogma, and thinking requires curiosity. So I'm going to be professorial just for a second. Can you see this box? Great. That box is Canada. Okay? You know the mental map you have of Canada? It's a box, right? What's this border called? America. This is Europe. We have two new wicked borders this century, didn't you know? We just don't realize it yet, but they're very real and they will press our existence very soon, and they've already begun to press at the margins. What's this one called? China. What's this one? China is a very wicked border because we're much closer to the Chinese than the Australians are. We don't realize it, but if you're in Yellowknife, in Whitehorse, or Prince Rupert, you're very close to Asia, much more than the Sydney-siders or Canberra or Brisbane. It's just that we've never known China. We're a democracy that the entire life of which escapes the centrality of China. We miss China by a few years. They lose their second Opium War in the 1860s, and Canada's created right afterwards. So China is a destabilized non-factor for the first 150 years of Canada. The China that Pierre Trudeau visited at the time, in which he was just an exceptional white man who was curious about what was complete departure to the China of today, which is a formidable machine. Okay? It's non-democratic. Take that as a fact. It's a reality. we must reckon with it at our border. The Russian border is all of a sudden central because the Arctic is melting, right? So we're very close all of a sudden from Yellowknife to Moscow or Irkutsk. Russia's not out here. Russia's up here. Who's going to defend us? Maybe A? Maybe E? We have to get smart. So we have to be democratic in the context of great pressures from great countries, big powers, democratic and non-democratic. Remember, Socrates may have been an early proto-democrat. Plato was a proto-democrat, but he was always aux aguets vis-a-vis the Persians, Byzantium, other city-states. So they were building this democracy not in a vacuum. You cannot talk about the charter without understanding the global context in which it operates, right? And that requires us to get out of this, what I still call a colonial box that we live in psychologically, where the Americans do the big thinking, the Britons do the big thinking, but we get closed in. Our beautiful democratic gets closed in by wicked forces that could take us into the dustbin of history. So I can talk about what's to be done in question and answer. I got some things for that, but I'll just say that I'm very proud of our democracy. It is one of the great democracies in the world. It is a de minimis project. So be a believer, but have that degree of skepticism. It's as if my students always say, Professor, what's the key to happiness? And I always say, we Russian Jews don't believe in happiness. Right? We start with a de minimis proposition of let's just exist and then build on that edifice. And we've done a pretty good job, right? But nothing is to be taken for granted. Thank you very much.